Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time when dust clung to your boots and your faith was the only map you had. The era of the Crusades wasn't just about swords clashing for the Holy Land. It was about wandering souls, broken sandals, misplaced hopes, and the deeply human chaos of believing you were part of something grand. Whether you owned a castle or a pig, if you heard the call to Jerusalem, you were expected to go. And once you said yes, whether in a cathedral or halfway through a drunken bar bet, there was no going back. It often started not with a sword but with a sermon. Loud, thunderous, and just vague enough to be terrifying. You'd be standing in the back of a crowd, half listening while a man in robes shouted about sins, salvation, and how a city most of you couldn't even place on a map had suddenly become everyone's personal responsibility. The word Jerusalem floated through the air like smoke, holy and intangible. You weren't sure if it was east or south or somewhere near the tavern, but you nodded along like everyone else. Then came the promise, full forgiveness, eternal reward, heaven itself for the low cost of abandoning your life and maybe dying in the dirt somewhere. And that sounded, well, better than barley stew for the 100th time and another winter of your mother-in-law, reminding you that your field hadn't yielded much. So, whether from boredom or belief or just because someone dared you, you agreed. Of course, agreeing meant nothing without action. So you did what many did, got swept up in the energy of the tavern, where piety and ale often mixed in equal measure. Maybe you drank too much, someone carved a cross into a table, someone else claimed divine inspiration, and suddenly you're waking up on straw with a headache, a wooden cross in your hand, and a friend clapping you on the back calling you crusader. No one checked your credentials. There was no standardized training or supply list. If you could walk, carry a bag, and vaguely remember which end of a sword pointed away from you, you were in. Maybe you received a blessing from a priest, more symbolic than strategic, and had a red cross stitched onto your tunic by someone who also stitched pig bladders. Then you were sent off. Not with weapons, but with instructions to bring what you could. You took them seriously. You gathered kitchen knives, maybe a rusted pan, and that one heavy stick your grandfather swore had once scared off a wolf. Gerald, your neighbor, brought a rake. Another man insisted on bringing a stool because you never know. There was no uniformity, no inspection, just bodies piling into a movement that had momentum but little direction. You told your family you were leaving in God's name. Your father asked who was feeding you along the way. You laughed. He didn't. And before the sun was high enough to warm your face, you were walking, clumsy, confused, overpacked, and underprepared. Your chain mail, if you were lucky enough to borrow some, stank like it had been through 3 wars and at least one swamp. Your boots were little more than stitched leather slippers, your legs wrapped in wool that itched like regret. Still you felt noble, holy even, until you tripped on a rock and someone's goat sneezed in your direction. Then reality started to bite, not all at once. It began as discomfort, hot sun, heavy gear, awkward silences filled with prayers muttered half-sincerely. But discomfort turned to agony faster than you'd imagined. The chain mail dug into your neck, your belt cinched too tightly and refused to be adjusted, and every footstep felt like a negotiation between your will and your blisters. You told yourself this was the cost of glory, but no one warned you how slow glory marched. The column of people moved like a parade of uncertainty. Some were noblemen on horses shouting things like "forward," only to disappear for most of the day. Others were peasants carrying everything they owned, including small children, noisy animals, and an ever-shrinking idea of what God's will really looked like. Gerald had a wooden shield he carved himself. It had writing on it. You weren't sure what it said, but it wasn't Latin and it wasn't inspiring. There were rules technically: march in ranks, keep the peace, respect the locals. But within hours those rules collapsed under hunger, confusion, and one man who started shouting a psalm while stealing someone else's shoes. The road ahead was long, muddy, and sometimes indistinguishable from a riverbed. You slipped. Others fell. The sky mocked you with rain, sun, or both in succession. By the time night fell, you had traveled perhaps 12 miles. It felt like 12 years. You lay down in wet grass beside strangers, your body aching in new places, your spirit trying to remember why you started. Someone near you snored like they were choking on a hymn. You envied their peace. Sleep didn't come easy, and morning didn't come kindly. The days blurred. The food, if you could call it that, was either hard as stone or soft in the wrong places. Dried peas, old bread, stew of uncertain origin. Sometimes it was better not to ask. Hunger twisted your dreams and hallucinations crept in like shadows. You imagined a fig tree once. It turned out to be a scarecrow. Someone else licked his sword and claimed it tasted of victory. It tasted of rust. He regretted it. And still you walked. By day 4, your stomach had developed its own voice, a kind of low, mournful hymn that rose with every step. It sang of bread, of meat, of anything that wasn't a handful of dried peas or the heel of a biscuit so old it might predate the calendar. You learned quickly that promises of supplies were like mirages. Everyone swore the army was well stocked, and yet no one could tell you where the food actually was. Rumors circled like flies. Some said a monk named Brother Ulrich had hoarded it all under the pretense of fasting. You caught him chewing in the dark and decided he was fasting only in theory. The meals that did exist were less nourishment than challenge. Breakfast might be a lump of bread dense enough to crack a skull. You chewed it until your jaw begged for mercy. Lunch was a concept, no more, no less. Dinner. A stew that never answered questions. It smelled like something had once lived, possibly recently. There was something chewy in it. You hoped it was meat. Someone whispered it might be boot leather. You chose not to investigate further. But the worst wasn't the food. It was the smell. At first you tried to ignore it like one ignores an unpleasant thought. But by the end of the first week it was undeniable. You didn't just smell bad, you had become something else entirely. A walking bouquet of wet wool, rust, and fungal speculation. Everyone around you had joined in this olfactory betrayal of human dignity. The crusade began to resemble a mobile cheese wheel, rolling across the continent with determination and stench. There was no soap. If someone said they had soap, they were lying or deeply deluded. Water, when available, was reserved for drinking or cooling a fevered brow, not for cleaning your body. Your clothes, once marked with a proud red cross, were now stained the color of disappointment. Your undergarments had fused to your skin like regret. Your boots were damp, hostile, and possibly developing sentience. Lice had made themselves at home. You named them, joked about them, even bargained with them. They didn't listen. The nights were worse. You lay on hard ground beside strangers whose only consistency was their snoring, coughing, and the odd midnight prayer muttered with alarming intensity. One man whispered that his helmet was haunted. Another sang to his blisters. You considered bathing in a river once, only to find it already occupied by a man crying into his trousers. You nodded, turned away, and accepted your filth like a badge. There were no latrines, no privacy, no dignity. When nature called, you answered behind bushes, under wagons, or wherever your soul gave up resisting. You made eye contact with a man in the act once. Neither of you have been the same since. And then came the sickness. It didn't arrive with a dramatic flourish. It seeped in slowly, coughs, sneezes, a rash that looked like prophecy. You ignored it until it spread. One day Gerald's neck had a purple patch. He said it was just a heat rash. You began quietly preparing your will. Healers were no help. Their methods were as spiritual as they were questionable. Prayers, herbs, sometimes leeches. If they waved enough smoke in your face, maybe you'd recover out of sheer awkwardness. The sick were quarantined in tents, which meant they were left to cough and hope they died quickly. And still, you marched. Villages appeared along the route like promises of relief. They were not. The locals had seen crusaders before. They recognized the signs: hungry eyes, dirty feet, broken Latin. To them you were a plague in human form, uninvited, unwashed, and potentially armed. They barred their gates. Priests crossed themselves at you. Once you offered to trade for water and accidentally proposed to someone's goat. The goat declined. When you were allowed inside, it came with glares and overpriced bread. You paid a week's rations for something that tasted like varnish and made your stomach question your choices. Directions were given with smirks. You followed them for 2 days before realizing they led nowhere. But at least it wasn't raining, until it was. The rain didn't fall. It attacked. Your cloak clung to you like shame. The mud swallowed your boots. You fell forward, then backward. Gerald slipped into something that may have once been a cow. You didn't laugh, but your bones did. Your tent collapsed. Your stew turned to sludge. You looked to the sky and wondered if this was penance or punishment. And still you pressed on. Navigation was a myth. No one knew exactly where Jerusalem was. You followed a map that might have been drawn by a child or a very imaginative horse. The roads twisted. Forests became swamps. Swamps became mountains. You walked in circles and swore you saw the same rock twice. Someone insisted it was a different rock, holier. You disagreed. Spirits were low. Morale had turned to dust. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, someone whispered the words every crusader feared. I think we're lost. But onward you stumbled, driven by faith, by pride, by the sheer refusal to admit this had all been a mistake. You had started as a pilgrim. You had become a wanderer, a blistered, half-starved shadow of yourself wrapped in wet wool and wishful thinking. You were a crusader now, and the worst hadn't even happened yet. You imagined battle would be different. You pictured something noble, cinematic even, a grand clash of steel and righteousness. A tide of armored knights thundering into enemy lines with banners waving and trumpets sounding. What you got instead was noise. Screams, mostly. And confusion. A kind of panic so loud and disorienting that you weren't entirely sure if you were fighting or running or simply trying not to cry. It began with the shouting. Someone yelled charge, and like startled cattle the line surged forward. You joined in because not joining meant being trampled. Your helmet, if you had one, blocked most of your vision. Your sword, too heavy and too blunt, dragged in your hand like a reluctant mule. You lost your shield before the fight even started. Gerald had borrowed it to cook bacon and never gave it back. He claimed God told him it was fair game. There was no formation, no discipline. The front line ran toward the enemy. The back line ran in the opposite direction. Archers let loose arrows without warning. Someone was already on fire. A man screamed, not because he was injured, but because he'd stepped on a thorn. Another, in a frenzy of divine inspiration, charged forward shirtless with a pot on his head, yelling something about St. Michael and cheese. You swung wildly. You hit something, possibly a tree, possibly yourself. You screamed. It felt heroic for a second. Then you tripped, fell, and were stepped on by a donkey hauling cooking supplies. The donkey was braver than most of the army. The enemy was young, terrifyingly young. One of them couldn't have been more than 15, but he moved like someone who'd actually been trained. You locked eyes. He grinned. You considered dropping your weapon and pretending to be dead. In fact, pretending to be dead started sounding like a very good strategy. Perhaps the only one. There was dust everywhere. Commands were shouted in at least 4 languages. Someone began singing a drinking song from the tavern. Whether out of fear or madness, it caught on. Soon, dozens of men were chanting a ballad about sheep while ducking arrows and flailing spears. It was not glorious. It was surreal. And yet somehow you survived. When the shouting stopped and the dust settled, the battlefield looked like a butcher's nightmare. The wounded crawled away. The dead didn't. You were bleeding from your ankle. You didn't know how. Gerald was using your helmet as a soup bowl. A knight staggered past, missing most of his armor and one boot. No one spoke of victory. They just tried to breathe. The next few days blurred together in exhaustion and disillusionment. You were deeper into the journey now, approaching the Holy Land, though no one could say exactly how close. Directions were still guesses. Maps still contained dragons in the corners. Some thought the city was just beyond the next hill. Others believed you had already passed it. The land betrayed you. The weather worse. The sun roasted you in silence. Chain mail turned into an oven around your torso. You sweat through your tunic, your armor, your soul. The sand stuck to everything. Your boots squeaked with heat. Your water turned warm and tasted like iron and despair. You were fairly certain your shadow had started limping. Then, without warning, clouds rolled in. The air shifted. Thunder bellowed like a cursed prophet. And the skies opened. Rain, not a blessing but a punishment. It came down in sheets, furious and immediate. Your cloak clung to you like a shroud. Your tent collapsed before you even touched it. The roads turned to sludge. You slipped and fell twice, once into something that hissed. You didn't investigate. You found shelter under a tree, only to realize it was already occupied by goats and a man muttering psalms to his knees. You joined him for a moment. It felt like the most logical thing to do. When night fell, your teeth chattered so hard you feared they'd break. The cold sliced through your layers and lodged in your bones. You dreamed of fires. You woke to find a puddle in your ear. And still you marched. All around you, alliances frayed. Crusaders from different regions argued about saints, about strategy, about who got to sleep where. Your priest said the local Christians were heretics. The local bishop said your priest was an unwashed blasphemer. You tried to mediate and accidentally offended both. The Byzantine allies, whom you were told would welcome you, barely tolerated your presence. They locked their gates, posted archers, and offered vague hand gestures when asked for directions. You camped outside their cities like beggars, waiting for permission to pass. Permission often came only after bribes or long discussions about which version of Christianity you were supposedly following. Inside the camp, things weren't much better. Discipline dissolved into squabbles. One man started a new sect after seeing a vision in a chicken coop. Gerald declared himself the Fist of God and challenged 3 nobles to a duel. You avoided him. He had tied a cross to his chest with string and walked barefoot, whispering to his sword. You were fairly sure the sword was whispering back. Still, you believed. You had to. You weren't sure anymore what salvation looked like, but you had already come too far to turn back. You told yourself that this suffering meant something, that the pain would be redeemed, that the blood, the hunger, the madness, that it would all be made holy. And if it didn't, well, you would keep marching anyway. Because now you weren't just following a crusade, you were surviving one. And then at last, after weeks of walking, shouting, praying, and bleeding, you saw it. A city, perched behind thick, high walls. Not just a village or a scattering of houses, but a proper fortress of stone and iron, bristling with defenders who wanted you nowhere near them. And that meant only one thing: the order was given. Lay siege. It sounded impressive. In your mind, a siege was a powerful, dramatic thing. Siege engines, flaming projectiles, armies in flawless coordination. But in reality, it was medieval camping, just with more disease and worse food. You set up your tents outside the range of arrows, or at least you hoped it was outside the range. Someone was already testing the theory with their shoulder. There was no plan, not really. You were supposed to wait the defenders out, but no one had thought to bring enough food, or sanitation, or materials to build siege towers, or any real idea of what to do next. Someone tried to make a catapult out of tree branches and rope. It collapsed like a drunken moose. A battering ram was constructed from a fallen tree and bound with prayer. It lasted 10 minutes before it was on fire and rolling backwards toward your camp. You dug trenches. You stacked rocks. You argued over stew recipes. The defenders, meanwhile, seemed to be doing just fine. They waved at you from the walls, sometimes with bread in their hands, sometimes with less polite gestures. Occasionally they hurled waste down at your camp. You stopped looking up. Rain turned the ground to soup. Your tent leaked. Your socks disintegrated. You sat on a crate, staring at a wall that refused to care about your suffering. The stew that night tasted like rope and regret. Gerald caught a rat and named it dinner. You weren't sure if he meant it affectionately or literally, possibly both. Then came the noise, not battle cries, not horns, but something worse, the sound of boredom, of men singing badly, of instruments being played that should not have been touched. Someone brought out a lute. It sounded like a goat trapped in a wine barrel. Morale dipped further than the mud beneath your feet. The air around the camp turned heavy. The mix of unwashed bodies, rotting supplies, and the occasional dead horse created a stench that could flatten a bishop. The local priest declared it a test from God. You declared it a violation of nature. The goat refused to comment. Then came the assault, not because it was a good idea, but because everyone had run out of patience. Ladders were thrown against the walls. Arrows rained down. You tried to climb, made it 2 rungs, then slipped and fell onto a man who had just finished his last biscuit. He was not pleased. The assault failed, obviously. You all agreed to call it a probing attack and returned to your tents, bruised and embarrassed. Supplies dwindled, arguments increased. At one point, someone suggested eating the goat. A fistfight broke out. The goat won. But one morning, something changed. You noticed it in the air, quieter, tenser. Then the shout came. The gates had opened. No one knew why. Starvation, sabotage, or maybe divine intervention. But it didn't matter. The army surged forward, a chaotic, roaring flood of hunger and desperation. You were swept along, sword in hand, breath tight, heart pounding. Inside the city, everything broke. There were no ranks, no commanders, no order, only panic and noise. Smoke curled through the streets. People screamed, some in battle, some in prayer, some in sheer confusion. You tripped over rubble, got kicked by someone who didn't notice you, and lost your helmet. A knight galloped past with a chandelier under one arm. Gerald was standing on a barrel, drinking from a jug and declaring himself lord of this alley. You found yourself inside a half-burned house, staring at a goblet, a cat, and a tapestry too large to carry. You picked up the goblet, the cat hissed. You left the tapestry. There was no glory, no clear moment of triumph. Only a strange stillness after the storm. The city had fallen. You had won. But standing amid rubble and ash, you didn't feel victorious. You felt sticky, exhausted, a little sick. A priest patted your shoulder and muttered something about God's will. You nodded, unsure. You come seeking redemption. You found looted relics, broken doors, and Gerald vomiting onto a holy icon. This was victory, apparently. And you were part of it. You sat down on the edge of a cracked fountain, your sword nicked, your hands shaking, your soul uncertain. Around you, others celebrated in the only way they knew, drunken songs, crude jokes, pockets filled with coins and spoils. You stared at the goblet you'd taken. It was dented, possibly cursed. You didn't care. You had survived. And in this war, that was about as close to glory as most would ever get. In the days that followed, something in you began to shift, not with clarity or sudden realization, but in the slow erosion of what you used to believe. You had arrived in the Holy Land, or near enough, but there was no divine choir waiting for you, no celestial voice whispering that your suffering had been seen and counted. There was only dust, fatigue, and the uneasy murmur of men who no longer knew what they were supposed to feel. The land itself seemed to conspire against you. The heat arrived like punishment. It pressed down without mercy, baking the metal of your chainmail until it felt like a blacksmith had wrapped your ribs in fire. You sweated through cloth, leather, and pride. Your boots squelched with every step, your breath came in short bursts. A night beside you hallucinated a tavern on the horizon. You saw it too, just long enough to miss it when it disappeared. And then, as if the sky itself mocked your misery, the weather turned. Thunder snarled from the clouds and the wind brought rain, heavy, vengeful, cold. The same boots that had cooked your feet now froze them. Your fingers turned stiff, your sword became an icicle with a handle. You tried to build a fire, but the wood was damp, your matches useless, and your hands trembled too much to hold them. You sat beside a tree, watching rain streak down your helmet. Gerald wandered past, soaked to the bone, muttering about frogs falling from heaven. You didn't ask. The camp around you sank into a strange silence, not restful but stunned, the sort of quiet that follows long madness. The marching slowed, the noise faded. Everyone began walking with heads lowered, boots dragging, eyes hollow. The Holy Land hadn't welcomed you. It had endured you. And now came the true confusion. You were supposed to be part of a holy army, a single, unified force. But that illusion crumbled like the biscuits in your rations. You were Latin-speaking, Western-born, and crusted with sin and dirt. But the Byzantines, they were different. Greek-speaking, clean-shaven, cold-eyed. They crossed themselves the wrong way. Their priests looked at yours like suspicious ants watching a wedding they disapproved of. They were meant to be allies. In practice, they locked you out of their cities and watched from the walls. Your priest whispered that their entire theology was heresy. Their bishop responded by calling your army illiterate sheep with swords. You avoided both. The confusion didn't stop there. Among the locals there were Christians of every kind, Armenians, Syriacs, Arabs. Some prayed like you, some didn't. You tried to explain your mission to them. One man set your tent on fire. Another gave you bread and cursed you under his breath. You no longer trusted anyone who smiled. Even the enemy wasn't just one army. There were factions within factions. Fatimids, Seljuks, tribal leaders, city governors. One day you fought a group flying a green banner. The next, one of their men sat beside your fire, explaining that they'd switched sides. He ate your last onion and asked for more. Your commander, if he could be called that, attempted diplomacy. He gathered leaders of the different crusading groups and the local guides. The meeting lasted 20 minutes before someone threw a cup and declared their saint superior to all others. Gerald proposed a duel. Everyone agreed it was the only logical solution. You began to wonder if you'd ever really known what you were doing here. Even within your own camp, there was division. Nobles shouted about glory and land. Peasants just wanted food and shade. Priests preached, soldiers gambled, and a man with no eyebrows claimed to see angels in puddles. You watched a knight threaten a baker over stale bread. The baker hit him with a rolling pin. No one intervened. You'd come expecting brotherhood. What you found was chaos in matching tunics. The days blurred. You forgot what you used to look like. Your reflection in a pool showed a gaunt stranger, eyes ringed in exhaustion, face cracked with sun and dirt. Your armor no longer fit. Your shoulders had reshaped under its weight. Your faith changed. Once, you believed in the simplicity of good versus evil, that the road to Jerusalem was the road to redemption. But now, you believed in practical boots, in bread without worms, in people who didn't talk to goats, and still you stayed. Not because you understood the mission anymore, but because turning back wasn't an option. You were too far gone, too altered. The journey had hollowed out something in you and filled it with noise, confusion, and the unshakable knowledge that this wasn't about salvation. It was about survival, and even that was no longer guaranteed. You thought that when the fighting ended, when the city fell and the banners were planted in the dust, something would settle inside you. A peace, maybe. A sense of completion. Instead, you found yourself sitting on a splintered crate amid the broken ruins of a place you barely understood, wondering when exactly your soul had started to go quiet. You were thinner now. Not in a heroic, sculpted way, but in the brittle, sunken way of someone who had given too much of their body to mud, hunger, and sleepless nights. Your cheeks were hollow, your ribs visible through your tunic. Your hands shook when you held your sword, not from fear anymore, but from the exhaustion of holding it too long. You were dirtier, too. That felt inevitable. Filth had become part of your skin. The last bath you remembered involved a rainstorm and an argument over a bucket. Your hair clung to your scalp like seaweed. Your armor clinked not from polish, but from the dried remnants of a dozen spilled stews and unspoken regrets. And your boots, you didn't take them off anymore. You were afraid of what lived beneath them. But what haunted you most was not what had been taken from your body. It was what had been taken from your mind, from your memory. You could barely recall your village's name. Your father's voice was distant. The scent of barley fields and the sound of rain on your roof, once so vivid, now felt like pieces of someone else's story. You remembered more about Gerald's snoring than your mother's face. Back home, they would call you a hero. They would ask you to tell your tale. And maybe you would. Maybe you'd sit by the hearth and describe the siege in dramatic tones. You'd lift your goblet, one of the few things you'd taken from the city, and say it was from a sacred chapel, not a wine cellar. You described the final charge, conveniently skipping the part where you tripped on rubble and nearly cried. But the truth wasn't made for taverns. It wasn't made for songs or stories or even sermons. Because how could you explain what it felt like to survive a war no one truly commanded? A war run by amateurs and mystics, by nobles who gave speeches and vanished, and by men like Gerald, who painted soot crosses on their chests and claimed to hear angels in the thunder. Your sword was dented now. Your faith was complicated. You had once believed that evil could be seen from a distance, that it wore different armor, spoke another language, and bled darker blood. But in the firelight of a ruined alley, you saw men who prayed like you tear gold from corpses and laugh as they did it. So you adjusted your expectations. You began to believe in smaller things, in dry bread, in not dying in your sleep, in a goat that didn't try to bite you, in a day without rain, and most of all, in the idea that maybe you could get home and forget just enough to keep living. You told yourself the relics you carried, bits of bone, a chipped chalice, a cloth embroidered with something that might be sacred, would give your suffering meaning. You'd hang them on your wall. You'd nod solemnly when the priest spoke of sacrifice. You'd smile at the children who asked you if you saw Jerusalem. You'd say yes. You wouldn't say what it looked like. And maybe, if you were lucky, no one would ever mention the bishop's hat you once mistook for a stew pot, or the day you cried after losing your belt, or the night you screamed during a dream and woke the entire tent, including the goat. Was it worth it? History, you suppose, will say yes. The chronicles will write of victories, of cities taken, of relics retrieved. Your name may appear on a list somewhere or in the margins of a dusty book read by monks centuries from now. You'll nod when they say Deus Vult. You'll polish the goblet. You'll avoid looking goats in the eye. You'll go to church and stare at the stained glass windows, wondering if heaven still wants you. And deep down, beneath all of it, that little twitch in your left eye, the one that started sometime between the first siege and the third stew, will whisper the truth. Probably not. There were stories you'd heard as a child, tales whispered beside fires, embroidered with glory. Heroes charging into battle with banners high, knights standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the shining light of divine justice. But by the end of your campaign, you knew better. The crusade hadn't been led by saints and strategists. It had been driven forward by chaos in chainmail, ambition in a bishop's robe, and hunger in a peasant's eyes. You had expected honor. What you found was a marching circus, stitched together from every corner of Europe. To your left, a baker from Toulouse who carried a rolling pin as his only weapon. To your right, a man named Tybalt who claimed to be a monk but cursed like a pirate, drank anything from a jug, and once stabbed a man over a stale loaf of bread. The knight in charge of your column was 19 years old, smelled of roses and inexperience, and led you into a cabbage field during a battle. He claimed it was a flanking maneuver. No one believed him. Then there were the fanatics. Men who believed they could not die because God was personally guarding their every step. They fought barefoot, shirtless, and sometimes swordless. Just blind faith and a wooden stick carved with prayers. They charged into enemy lines like thunder, and were usually carried out before sunset. Their survival rate was about as reliable as your water supply. A merchant had followed your group for weeks, hawking dubious relics with the confidence of a man who'd never let truth interfere with sales. One day he offered you the toe of St. Peter. The next, the toenail of St. Paul. Both looked suspiciously like animal bones. He once sold someone a twig claiming it was the true Crusader's toothpick. The man who bought it swore it cured his blisters. You quietly buried yours. And then there were the children, not soldiers, just children. No one knew who they belonged to or why they were there. But they marched with you, wide-eyed and laughing, seemingly immune to despair. They sang songs in languages you barely understood and somehow always had better food than you. They were the only ones who didn't look broken. At night, the camp came alive with its own peculiar rituals. Arguments over theology erupted into fistfights. One man declared himself bishop of the tents and began delivering sermons from atop a wine barrel. His theology was questionable, his balance worse. Someone else started a prayer group that devolved into a gambling circle. You stopped asking questions. What held the army together wasn't command. It wasn't discipline or faith. It was mutual suffering. Every man, woman, and child walking beside you carried the same weight, the burden of having left home for something they no longer recognized. You didn't fight alongside saints. You marched beside fools, dreamers, liars, and drunks. And yet somehow they became your people. There were moments of strange beauty. A violin played in the night. A child offering you a crust of bread without speaking. A stranger lifting you from the mud during a retreat without asking your name. Small gestures in a world gone mad. You learned that brotherhood doesn't always look like honor. Sometimes it's the man beside you handing you the last piece of his biscuit. Sometimes it's Gerald, shirtless, sunburned and half-mad, slapping you on the back and telling you you'll survive this, even if he has no idea how. And survive you did. Somehow. The banners were torn, the swords dulled, the mission mudded, but you were still standing. And that by Crusade standards made you a legend. When people ask you about the Crusades, they always expect stories of battle, of swords clashing, of banners waving, of holy light pouring down onto the victorious. They don't expect what you remember. The long silence after the battle, the muddy stew that tasted faintly of rat, the strange way your skin clung to your armor after a week without washing. They don't want to hear about the man who used your helmet as a latrine bucket, or the priest who forgot every Latin word except the ones for blessing and loot. They don't want to hear about the basilica cistern. You remember it well, though not by name at the time. You only knew you were in a city built like a maze, every corner whispering of an empire that had once been greater, cleaner, more precise than anything you'd ever seen. Beneath it all, water ran in silence. You descended into it by accident, chasing a rumor or a missing mule. Or maybe Gerald fell through a trapdoor again. It was cold down there and quiet. A cathedral of columns, endless and wet, standing in black water. You didn't speak. No one did. The ceiling dripped like the past itself was trying to cry. You walked on stone that echoed under your feet, each step sounding like it might disturb the dead. And maybe it did. Two heads caught your attention, not real heads. Stone ones. Carved with such precision they seemed alive. One lay on its side. The other was upside down, as if the builders had lost interest halfway through or were trying to offend the gods. You didn't know who she was at the time. Medusa, someone said. You didn't ask how he knew. She looked like someone who had once been powerful and had been buried under weight she didn't deserve. You understood. You touched her once just to see if she was real. She was cold, smoother than you expected. You didn't feel cursed. You felt seen. That place stayed with you. Long after the battles, after the cities taken and abandoned, after the relics stolen and sold. Long after you stopped believing in the version of yourself who had once cried during a sermon and thought that was enough to save a soul. The cistern remained in your memory like a hidden chamber, its columns standing in your dreams, quiet, watchful. The journey home wasn't quick. For many, it didn't happen at all. Some stayed, carving out lives in the shadows of old walls. Others vanished, swallowed by ambush, disease, or despair. You walked for months. Your boots, those same cursed boots, finally gave out. You tied rags around your feet and kept going. When you returned, no one recognized you. You didn't blame them. You barely recognized yourself. You spoke less. You sat with your back to walls. You kept your water in stone jars without knowing why. They called you a pilgrim, a hero. They asked for stories. You gave them the polished versions, dramatic battles, near misses, holy light. You left out the part where you wept in the mud after realizing you'd forgotten your mother's face. Or the part where you nearly killed a man over a piece of bread. Or the time you accidentally confessed to a goat. You kept a relic, just one. A twisted piece of iron shaped like a cross. You didn't remember where you found it. You hung it on your wall and stared at it sometimes, wondering if it had ever belonged to someone who knew what they were doing. You didn't write songs. You didn't start a cult. Gerald did both. You simply lived. You tried not to flinch when someone said the word crusade. You gave money to the poor. You lit candles for the dead. You walked through the village with your head down and your eyes scanning for signs of rain or dust or columns that shouldn't be there. And when no one was watching, sometimes you whispered thanks, not to heaven, but to the silence beneath the stone. Before the crusade, you thought enemies wore different colors, that you'd know them by the banners they flew, the gods they swore by, the languages they cursed in. You imagined facing the infidel as a clear, holy task, good versus evil, west versus east, Christian versus not. But standing in the heat of that foreign sun, you realized something uncomfortable. The lines blurred, then vanished altogether. Your enemies were not what the sermons had promised. Yes, there were Muslim armies, but they weren't one thing. They weren't unified or monstrous or even always hostile. Some fought you. Others traded with you. One man who had aimed a bow at your chest a week earlier now sold you dates and lentils. You shared a fire once, too tired to argue, too human to care. You didn't understand his words, but his laughter was familiar. There were factions within factions. Seljouks, Fatimids, desert warlords, mercenaries, city guards. Some switched sides mid-campaign. One even offered to guide you, though in hindsight, he might have just led you in circles. Another sat by your campfire explaining regional politics while eating your last fig. You nodded politely and considered strangling him. You met Christians, two Easterners with strange accents and older churches. They crossed themselves differently and looked at your priest like he was an unruly student. You thought they'd welcome you. Instead, they locked their doors and watched you pass like a storm they hoped would miss them. You couldn't blame them, not after what you'd seen. Sometimes you couldn't even tell who was fighting whom. A town would open its gates with smiles and close them with arrows. A monk would bless you one day and denounce you the next. Cities changed hands like dice. One morning you raised your sword against a group that, by evening, was marching under your banner. No one bothered to explain. They just shrugged and said, "The wind changed." Even among your own, unity was a fading myth. The nobles argued over land they hadn't won. The bishops argued over relics. The soldiers argued over everything else: water, women, rumors, scripture. At one point, a priest claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary in a well. A dozen men threw themselves into it. Gerald nearly drowned. He came out declaring he'd been rebaptized and promptly started his own theology. You did not subscribe. You had come with the belief that righteousness would guide you, that right would shine brighter than wrong, that salvation had a shape. But in those camps, those trenches, those burning cities, you learned that belief could be bent, that good men did terrible things when hungry, that sacred causes could be twisted by the desperate, and that sometimes evil didn't wear the other side's flag. Sometimes it sat beside you, singing hymns. You adjusted your expectations again. Not for glory, not for justice, but for the smallest of dignities. A loaf of bread shared without a threat, a night without screaming, a moment of silence under a sky that didn't feel like it was watching. You still called yourself a crusader. It was easier than explaining everything else. But you knew, deep down, that what you were was something more complex, a survivor of a cause that had outgrown its purpose, a footnote in a march that had become a wandering. And the most honest prayer you whispered was no longer for victory. It was for clarity, for some sign that in this storm of confusion, something still made sense. Even if that something was just the sound of your own feet moving forward, one step at a time. You reached the walls of another city, its name lost in translation, its history unknown to you. All you saw were its height, its thickness, and the rows of archers staring down like statues waiting for a reason to move. There was no discussion, no negotiation, just the familiar command shouted across dust and distance: lay siege. You were used to it by now, the ritual of failure, the tents flung up with false hope, the trenches dug without strategy, the battering ram cobbled together from a tree and raw enthusiasm. You watched it collapse before it touched the gate, flames licking at its side like it had volunteered to burn. You didn't even flinch anymore. The others groaned. Some prayed. Most just sat down and began the slow descent into siege-time madness. It was a strange rhythm, laying siege. The days were long, hot, and fruitless. The nights were damp and restless. The soldiers grew bored, then reckless. Someone always started singing. Someone always lost a boot. Someone always insisted on digging a latrine too close to the stew pot. You tried not to eat much. The food had taken on a life of its own. Bread that crumbled like stone. Stew that smelled of betrayal. A dried fish passed from hand to hand like a relic until it vanished. No one claimed to have eaten it. You suspected Gerald. The stench returned, thicker now. Horses died. Rats flourished. Men stopped pretending to care. The priest said the odor was divine punishment. You said it was dysentery. He did not appreciate your insight. The only entertainment came from arguments. A dispute over a missing spoon turned into a duel. The spoon was never found. A noble accused another of stealing his tent pole. Both ended up sharing a blanket, glaring. You stayed quiet. You had learned that silence was often the only shield you had left. Then, one morning, something shifted. The sun rose in a way that felt staged. Too bright, too slow, too symbolic. You heard the shout ripple through the camp before you saw it yourself. The gates were open. No explanation, no ceremony. Just two great wooden doors yawning like a mouth inviting chaos. And chaos accepted. The army surged forward, not in ranks but in a stampede. You were swept along by elbows, curses, and the clattering of weapons hastily unsheathed. You tried to keep pace, tried to remember the plan, though you were fairly sure there never had been one. You tripped on rubble. Someone trampled you. Someone else apologized while looting a chandelier. You regained your footing by grabbing a tapestry. It tore. You carried it anyway. Inside the city, all rules died. It wasn't a battle, it was a flood. Walls collapsed. Fires leapt. Screams came from every direction, many in your own language. You turned a corner and found Gerald declaring himself ruler of an alley, wielding a fork and wearing someone else's crown. A knight galloped past on a horse that clearly didn't belong to him, dragging a carpet behind him like a cloak. You laughed once, then stopped. Because in the middle of it all there were civilians, faces wide-eyed and stunned, children clutching doors, elders kneeling, not praying but bracing. You looked at them and they looked at you, not with hatred but with the emptiness of people who had already lost everything. That's when you felt it, not victory, not triumph. Wait. Guilt crept in, quiet and stubborn. You kept moving because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant breaking. You collected what spoils you could, a goblet, a cloth, a handful of coins that might be cursed. You told yourself it was compensation. You told yourself everyone else was doing worse. You told yourself that survival had a cost, but still, when the fires settled and the screams turned to sobs, you found yourself standing among ashes. A city conquered, a crusade progressed, a war supposedly advanced. You looked at your hands, they were full, but your heart, empty. You never really knew what peace felt like during the crusade, only pauses. Moments of eerie stillness between chaos, where the noise faded just enough for you to hear your own breath. After the last city fell, after the looting quieted and the fires burned low, those moments grew longer. But they weren't peaceful. They were heavy. The war, if you could still call it that, had taken everything simple and turned it sideways. The enemies hadn't always worn turbans. The allies hadn't always spoken your prayers. The truth was that the Holy Land didn't feel holy at all. It felt tired. It felt used. You had made it. You stood in Jerusalem, or near enough. No trumpet greeted you. No angel choir descended. No priest lifted a scroll and declared you pure. You just walked in, shoulders sagging, boots dragging, holding a stolen goblet in one hand and a sense of confusion in the other. You sat on a stone bench in the corner of a ruined square and looked around. There were others like you sitting in silence staring, some clutched relics, some wept. Some stared into the distance as if expecting to see home on the horizon. One man knelt, not to pray, but because his legs had stopped listening. A woman stood barefoot, her feet blistered open, holding a piece of the wall as if it were treasure. No one spoke. You looked up at the sky, it was just sky. No revelation, no divine thunder, no sign from God. You were waiting for something to feel different, for something inside you to light up and say, this was worth it. But all you felt was a deep ache, like grief, like the kind of sorrow that doesn't come from a wound but from a realization. You could never go back to who you were before. You had survived starvation, fever, rain, arrows, Gerald. You had seen children sing in tents, men die in alleys, cities fall for reasons no one could explain. You had fought a war no one could properly define, in a place no one seemed able to control. You had followed a map drawn in rumor and prayer, and now, finally, you stood at the end of that map and found nothing waiting. You weren't angry, you weren't disappointed, you were simply changed. Not in the way pilgrims describe with glowing eyes and holy words. You had no verses ready, no speeches. You didn't feel saved. You didn't feel condemned. You just felt old. Even if your body wasn't yet 30, your soul had aged by centuries. It had absorbed every cold night, every broken oath, every scream beneath a falling wall. You would carry those things home, not on your back but inside your ribs, where no one could see but where they would settle and grow roots. And yet even then, some small part of you held on, not to faith necessarily, but to the belief that something might still come of this. That one day you'd sit by a fire and a child would ask, "What was the crusade like?" And you'd smile not because it was funny or noble or righteous, but because it had happened, and you had come through it, not as a knight, not as a saint, but as a survivor. Time passed, but not in the way it once did. After the sieges, after the slaughter, after the final unsteady march into the dust-choked streets of the Holy Land, everything moved slower, like the world itself had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. The war hadn't ended. Wars like these didn't end. They simply scattered, fragmented, faded into smaller skirmishes and rumors. But for you, the fire had burned out. You no longer marched for God. You walked now for bread, for shade, for places without screaming. You stopped counting days. You stopped counting anything, really. The numbers had broken long ago, of cities, of miles, of friends buried quickly with a prayer mumbled through cracked lips. You tried to leave, but the land clung to you, not with chains or armies, but with silence, the kind that wraps around your boots and seeps into your bones. You wandered for a while, from outpost to outpost, from ruined fortress to makeshift chapel. Some crusaders stayed behind, still clutching their purpose like a relic. Others drank themselves quiet. Some vanished without a sound. You found yourself working odd tasks, hauling stone, patching cloaks, mending fences in places that had long forgotten what peace felt like. You weren't a knight anymore if you ever were. You were just a man who had once walked across continents for a cause he no longer understood. And you weren't alone. The survivors found each other without trying. You could spot them by the way they sat, always with their backs to a wall, by the way they looked at food like it might disappear, by the way they flinched at sudden shouts or stared too long at a burning candle. You rarely spoke, but when you did, it wasn't about battles. It was about the strange things. The man who carried a piano for half the march, the goat that survived more sieges than most soldiers, the time Gerald tried to baptize a horse. These were the stories that stuck, not because they were important, but because they were absurd. And in absurdity there was mercy. Eventually you found a caravan heading west. You had just enough coin and just enough strength to walk with them. No one asked where you were from. No one asked why you walked with a limp. They accepted you the way the land did, quietly, indifferently, completely. The journey home wasn't heroic. It was long and dull and filled with more waiting than walking. You stared at horizons that never came closer. You passed cities you no longer remembered the names of. And all the while, you wondered what you would say when you finally stood on the doorstep of the life you left behind. Would they recognize you? Would they know what to ask? Would you tell them the truth? That the crusade wasn't a glorious charge through history. It was a slow collapse of certainty. A parade of wounds and weather and decisions made in hunger and faith and desperation. That you hadn't come back with treasure, only tremors. That the real relic you carried was silence. And that some nights when the wind howled through the trees just right, it sounded like a trumpet. And you hated it. You returned, but not the way you imagined. Not as a hero with banners flying. Not to the sound of church bells or the smell of roasting meat. You walked into your village like a ghost slipping through the walls of a story. Some recognized you, others hesitated. You looked too different, and they weren't wrong. You said little. The story stayed curled at the back of your throat, tangled and heavy. What could you say? That your sword never felt like justice. That your prayers had dried up in a muddy field somewhere outside Antioch. That you no longer remembered what heaven was supposed to feel like. They asked, of course. What was it like? They said, with wide eyes and mouths already hungry for tales of glory. You smiled and said, incredible. Because chaotic, brutal, and morally confusing didn't fit well into the rhythm of a tavern song. You polished the relics you brought back. You mounted one on the wall, a chipped goblet you found near a burned chapel. You told visitors it came from a holy altar. You didn't mention the rats, or the smoke, or the broken crucifix beside it. On Sundays, you sat in the back of the chapel near the door. You nodded during sermons. You crossed yourself when told. You avoided speaking to the priest. You stared at the candles and thought about the time your torch wouldn't light in the rain and how that moment, fumbling, soaked, desperate, felt more sacred than anything that followed. You avoided looking goats in the eye. Gerald came back too, eventually. He wrote poetry now, badly. He recited it in the square, half-dressed, always barefoot. Some people laughed, some nodded solemnly. You just listened because deep down you were grateful someone else remembered. Others didn't come back. You saw them in dreams, sometimes marching, sometimes silent, sometimes screaming without sound. You whispered their names in the night, and when the wind answered, you told yourself it was nothing. You donated what you could to the local monastery. Quiet gifts, bread, tools, a half-cracked icon. You never spoke about the time you nearly stabbed a man over a piece of dried fruit, or the time you drank water from a stream and threw up for 2 days, praying to a God who no longer felt close. Some things were better left buried. Years passed. The crusade became a tale, one told by men who weren't there, sung by minstrels who had never seen a dying soldier whisper for his mother while clutching a rusted spoon. History polished what reality had shattered. Your name, if it was mentioned at all, was wrapped in words like valor and faith. But you knew better. You had not gone on a crusade. You had survived a disaster that wore a cross on its sleeve. And somewhere deep inside, under the quiet, beneath the chores and the prayers and the years that followed, you carried one truth with you. The Holy Land had never been a place. It had been a promise, and promises, like swords, dull when dragged too far across the dirt.